So here's the thing about the whole royal family is one big happy unit narrative. It works great for photographs, but the second you zoom in on what is actually happening between the adults and the kids, the crack starts showing. And apparently the biggest crack right now runs straight between Catherine and Queen Camilla, because Catherine recently caught Camilla bullying her daughter, Princess Charlotte. And the fallout has been way more intense than anyone expected. Before we get into it, make sure to hit subscribe to Crown Watch so you don't miss any updates on this story. The wildest part of this whole situation isn't even the confrontation itself. It is that Camilla apparently thought nobody would notice what she was doing, like she genuinely believed she could keep making these little comments, these small jabs, an 8-year-old girl, and nobody would pick up on the pattern. But Catherine noticed, and once Catherine notices something involving her kids that is basically at the situation started during what was supposed to be a completely normal family gathering at Windsor Castle. We are talking about a private luncheon, the kind of thing the royal family does all the time, multiple generations under one roof. Some of Camilla people, Catherine's family, the usual mix of extended royals who don't always gel perfectly, but know how to make it through an afternoon. Catherine has been doing these events for years now. She knows the rhythm. She knows when to smile, when to nod, when to excuse herself, but she also knows her daughter. And that morning, Charlotte was off, not sick, not throwing a tantrum, just quiet in a way that didn't sit right, the kind of quiet where a kid is trying to make themselves invisible. And for a child like Charlotte, who is typically confident and chatty, that should have been the first red flag. The children were set up in one of the side salons, supposed to be having their own little afternoon tea while the adults mingled. Catherine got Charlotte settled, kissed her forehead, left the room. Everything seemed fine. About 45 minutes later, Catherine is in the middle of a conversation with some senior courtier when she sees Charlotte walking past with the open doors across the corridor, and the look on that little girl's face stopped her cold. Charlotte wasn't crying. There were no tears, but her face had gone pale. Her mouth was pressed into this tight line, and she looked emotionally bruised in a way that is almost worse than physical hurt, because it is harder to fix. Catherine excused herself mid-sentence, which, if you know anything about royal protocol, is not something you do lightly. She followed Charlotte down to the far end of the hallway near the service doors and found her just standing there, hands clasped, staring at the floor. When Catherine asked what happened, Charlotte said nothing. Classic kid response when they're trying to protect someone where they're not sure if they're allowed to be upset. But Catherine crouched down to her eye level and said, "Sweetheart, I know when something is wrong." And that is when Charlotte told her granny Camilla had told her she was showing off, had told her not to speak unless she was spoken to context. With some guessing game the kids were playing, Charlotte had helped Louis with an answer, which is exactly the kind of thing an older sister should do. And Camilla got annoyed over a guessing game over a child helping her younger brother. Now here's where the pattern starts becoming obvious, and this is the part that I think really got to Catherine. It wasn't just that one comment later that same day during the family walk to the gardens. Catherine was watching everything. Camilla was ahead, walking beside Charles, chatting away like nothing had happened. And then during a refreshment break inside, Charlotte reached for a second scone. A child wanted a second scone at a family gathering, and Camilla turned, glanced down, and said with this half smile, "Perhaps one is enough, darling." We don't want to appear greedy who says that to a child who looks at an 8-year-old reaching for a baked good and decides that is the moment to police her body and her appetite. But the tone is what matters here. It wasn't said warmly. It wasn't a gentle suggestion. It was a correction wrapped in a smile, the kind of comment that sounds almost reasonable if you repeat out of context. But in the moment, with the look and the timing, it lands completely differently. Catherine saw it clearly. Then these weren't isolated incidents. This was a pattern of small moments, each one seemingly minor on its own, but all directed at the same child, all designed to make Charlotte feel like she was too much, too loud, too present. Catherine didn't make a scene. That is not who she is. She has learned over the years that her silence is more powerful than any outburst, and she knows how to wait. But the waiting had a purpose now. She was collecting evidence. Basically, she was watching, cataloging, and deciding exactly how she was going to handle this. William hadn't noticed anything yet because he had been busy with Charles and some senior aides discussing schedules. But that evening back at Adelaide Cottage, Catherine was going to lay it all out before that conversation could even happen, though. There was another moment, this one even more pointed. After tea. It had been clear the adults moved into one of the sitting rooms. The kids were allowed in for a bit before their nannies took them upstairs. Charlotte sat by the fireplace with a book when she politely asked Camilla if she could play the piano. Quietly, Camilla didn't just say no. She Said, "Darling, that is not necessary. Let the grown-ups enjoy some peace. Why don't you sit still like a proper young lady?" The words themselves are dismissive enough. But it was a delivery that cut sharp, pointed the kind of tone adults use when they want to put a child in their place without technically saying anything cruel. Charlotte's cheeks flushed. She closed her book and folded her hands. Catherine heard the whole thing from where she was standing nearby, and this time she didn't look away. She stared at Camilla. And the stare held long enough that Camilla noticed their eyes met for a brief second, and Camilla looked away. First that night at Adelaide Cottage, Catherine tucked Charlotte into bed herself. The house was quiet. William was finishing a call. George was already asleep. Catherine sat on the edge of Charlotte's bed and asked if she felt upset. Charlotte hesitated, then said she was okay. But Catherine told her she didn't have to pretend, and that is when Charlotte said it directly. "Granny Camilla doesn't like when I talk too much." There was no confusion, no ambiguity. An 8-year-old had perfectly understood the message being sent to her. Catherine kissed her forehead and walked down the hall to William's study. When he asked if Charlotte was all right, Catherine said she is trying to be, and then she told him everything, not with anger, but with clarity. She repeated Charlotte's exact words. She described every cold remark, every dismissive comment, every effort to silence or shrink Charlotte's presence. William listened without interrupting. When Catherine finished, his jaw was set. He agreed this wasn't something they let slide, but he also knew they had to handle it carefully. You don't just storm into a royal confrontation without thinking it through. The next morning, Catherine made her first move. There was a charity garden project that Camilla had arranged for a mix of royal grandchildren, and Catherine requested that Charlotte stay home. The official excuse was a minor cold, but the truth was Catherine didn't want Charlotte in that space again, not until she was sure her daughter would be safe from these little comments. Word got back to Camilla that Charlotte wouldn't be attending. Camilla's response, according to staff, was to raise an eyebrow and mutter under her breath, "Probably too delicate for a little mud." Catherine heard about that too, because royal households talk constantly, whether they're supposed to or not. So now the tension is building. Catherine is drawing her line. Camilla is being dismissive. And it all comes to a head the following weekend at High Road. Charles had invited William and Catherine for a small private dinner. The plan was simple family time, reconnecting, discussing upcoming royal tours. Charlotte came along just to say goodnight to her grandfather before bedtime. When she walked into the main lounge and politely said, "Good evening, Granny," Camilla barely looked up from her seat by the fire. Her response was, "Are you sure you're not too tired to be here?" It was a thinly veiled jab, and everyone in the room heard it. Catherine's expression didn't change dramatically, but something in her stillness shifted the entire mood of that room. The polite smile she had worn when they entered was gone. She turned to Charlotte and said calmly, "Why don't you say good night to Grandpa and head upstairs with Anna?" Charlotte, uncertain, glanced up at her mother. Catherine gave her a small nod. Charlotte hugged Charles and left with the nanny. The door clicked shut, and there was silence. Camilla sat back with her glass of wine and muttered, "Well, she is very sensitive, isn't she?" William froze. Charles shifted uncomfortably, but Catherine stepped forward, and every word she said was chosen with absolute precision. "No, she is not too sensitive. She is a child, and she deserves to be spoken to with kindness." Camilla raised her brow and tried to deflect. She was just surprised Charlotte was still up. It was hardly something to get upset about. And this is where Catherine didn't blink. She said, "It wasn't just a night. It has been happening for weeks. I have heard what has been said to her." And so as Charles tried to intervene, starting to say something about how maybe they should all just calm down, and Catherine cut him off calmly, firmly. But she cut him off. If it were just one comment, we would move on, but it is not one comment. It is a pattern. And I won't stand by while my daughter is made to feel less than. Camilla looked at William, clearly expecting him to step in and smooth things over. But he didn't. His silence in that moment said more than any words could. Catherine continued, "I've tried to keep peace, because that is what is expected of me. I have ignored moments that didn't feel right, but this is different. This involves Charlotte, and I won't let anyone know, matter who they are, undermine her confidence." Camilla tried one more time. She set her glass down, leaned forward, and said Catherine was reading too much into things, that she always took things so seriously, that children are resilient. And Catherine's response was perfect. Children remember how they are spoken to, especially by those who are supposed to protect them. There was nothing theatrical about it, no shouting, no storming out, just the voice of a mother who had drawn a line and wasn't going to erase it. William finally spoke, backing his wife completely. "We are asking for basic respect. Charlotte hasn't done anything wrong. She is just being herself. That shouldn't be a problem." Camilla looked at Charles, but Charles was silent now too. He knew better than to push. Catherine had laid down a boundary, and one she does, that there is really no going back. After a tense few minutes, Catherine excused herself and left the room. William followed shortly after. Upstairs, Catherine sat by Charlotte's Bedside again this time, she didn't ask if something was wrong, she just held her daughter's hand and told her, "You did nothing wrong, you were polite. You were kind, that's all I will ever ask of you." Charlotte looked up and said she tried to be, and Catherine told her she didn't have to try to be perfect, she just had to be herself. The months following that summer at Balmoral felt like walking across a frozen lake, where everyone knew the ice was thin, but nobody wanted to be the first to break it. The Palace PR machine continued to push the standard imagery of royal unity family photos at church services, coordinated outfits, smiling waves to crowds, but the dynamic behind closed doors had fundamentally shifted. Catherine had successfully drawn her boundary, and for the first time in years, the power balance within the inner circle had altered. Camilla was no longer casually dropping small remarks or testing limits, because she knew exactly what happened the second she crossed that line. Yet royal life doesn't pause for family tension. There were state visits, diplomatic receptions, charity patronages. And through it all, Catherine maintained her poise flawlessly. She looked every bit the future queen, graceful, composed, impeccably dressed, but her primary focus remained anchored entirely on her children, especially Charlotte. Life at Adelaide Cottage settled into a protective rhythm, where school runs, homework sessions, and quiet evenings replaced the endless round of superficial court. Socializing one particular Tuesday in late autumn brought a high-profile charity gala at the Victoria and Albert Museum, an event that required senior royals to be out in full force. Camilla was scheduled to attend alongside William and Catherine, and for weeks the palace aide had been quietly sweating over the seating arrangements and arrival logistics to avoid any awkward optics. Catherine arrived looking breathtaking in a tailored emerald gown, but her mind was already calculating the evening schedule, because Charlotte had a school spelling bee the next morning and promised herself she would be home by 8 to help her practice. William noticed the slight tension in her shoulders during the initial photo call and leaned in to whisper that everything was handled and that they could leave right after the main presentation. But before the evening could wrap up smoothly, a minor diplomatic incident occurred involving one of the foreign delegates who accidentally stepped out of protocol and approached Catherine directly, asking pointed questions about the children's schooling and media exposure. Catherine handled the moment with masterclass diplomacy, deflecting the probe with a warm smile and a pivot toward general education standards across the Commonwealth. Across the room, Camilla watched the exchange from a high cocktail table, sharing a low murmur with one of her personal advisors. And while she didn't say anything directly to Catherine that evening, the lingering look she gave her carried a heavy dose of resentment, because Camilla wasn't used to being sidelined or having a younger royal command the room with such effortless authority. The following morning at Adelaide Cottage began with bright autumn sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows, where Charlotte was sitting at the oak table frantically reviewing her vocabulary list with George and Louis teasing her about a tricky word like necessary. Catherine poured fresh juice and sat down beside her, gently reviewing the flashcards, making sure her daughter felt completely supported and calm, without a trace of the royal anxiety that typically plagued children in high-profile positions. Later that afternoon, after dropping the kids off at Lamrock School, Catherine attended a mental health symposium in central London, where she delivered a powerful speech emphasizing the crucial role of emotional safety in early childhood development. Every word she spoke carried a deeper resonance, given what had transpired behind palace walls over the previous months, when she spoke about protecting children from subtle psychological undermining and ensuring they feel valued for simply being themselves. The media outlets picked up on it immediately, with royal commentators dissecting every single syllable to find hidden meanings. Of course, the palace press office quickly issued a standard statement downplaying any specific connection, but anyone who knew the family context understood exactly what message was being sent home to Windsor. Meanwhile, back at Clarence's house, Camilla was dealing with her own frustration, feeling as though her decades of trying to establish her authority within the monarchy were being systematically dismantled by a mother protecting her 8-year-old daughter. The tension inevitably caught the attention of King Charles, who found himself once again caught between his wife and his beloved daughter-in-law. Charles attempted a quiet diplomatic mission, inviting William and Catherine for a private afternoon tea, without the children, hoping to broker a more permanent peace, accord between the two women. But Catherine wasn't interested in superficial handshakes or staged reconciliations that only served to sweep toxic behavior under the rug. When she and William arrived at the private study, Charles tried to steer the conversation toward family harmony and the importance of presenting a united front during the upcoming winter holiday season, Catherine listened respectfully, letting Charles finish his well-intentioned speech before she calmly laid out her perspective, once more explaining that unity could never come at the expense of her children's emotional well-being. She made it explicitly clear that while she respected the institution and her duties to the crown, she would never compromise on basic respect within the family circle. William stood firmly by her side, reinforcing every point his wife made, leaving Charles with a distinct realization that pushing the issue further would only fracture the family. The meeting ended without any dramatic outbursts, but with a silent understanding that the boundaries Catherine had established were permanent fixtures of royal life. As the weeks rolled toward December, preparations for the annual Sandringham Christmas gathering began filling every corner of the royal calendar. Sandringham has always been an intense logistical marathon, strict schedules, church walks, public greetings, and endless meals where every family member is expected to play their assigned role perfectly. For Charlotte and her brothers, it meant navigating a sea of cameras and well-wishers while trying to enjoy their holiday break. Catherine had already put strict protocols in place regarding the children's schedule, ensuring they had ample downtime away from the formal gatherings and, most importantly, restricting any prolonged one-on-one interactions between Charlotte and Camilla. When the family finally arrived at the Norfolk estate, the atmosphere was thick with traditional holiday cheer, masking the underlying current of caution that governed every adult interaction on Christmas Eve during traditional gift exchange. In the white drawing room, things remained civil and polite, with everyone exchanging light-hearted presents and holiday greetings. Camilla made a deliberate effort to be warm from a distance, even handing Charlotte a small wrap package containing a book on classical piano music, which was a clever attempt to olive branch her previous dismissive comments. Charlotte looked at her mother for guidance, and Catherine gave a subtle nod, allowing her daughter to accept the gift with gracious politeness, saying thank you clearly and politely before stepping back to join her brothers. But later that evening, during the adults-only reception in the main library, the fragile peace was tested once again, when a senior courtier casually mentioned an upcoming summer tour that would place Camilla and Catherine on overlapping international itineraries for several consecutive weeks. Camilla made a light remark, suggesting it would be a wonderful opportunity for Catherine to learn some deeper administrative ropes from her, a comment dripping with old guard condescension that implied Catherine still needed guidance. William tensed immediately, ready to step in with a sharp retort, but Catherine beat him to it. With a smile so cool and precise it left the room utterly silent, she looked directly at Camilla and replied smoothly, I believe my current schedule is quite full managing my family and my patronages, but I appreciate the thought. The subtle put-down was executed with such flawless royal polish that Camilla had no room to take offense publicly, though the flush in her cheeks revealed just how deeply the message landed. The holiday season progressed without any further major incidents, and the family successfully completed their traditional Christmas Day church walk, waving to the thousands of cheering fans lining the Norfolk paths, with Charlotte walking hand in hand between her parents, looking radiant, confident, and entirely unbothered by the heavy history swirling around her behind the scenes. However, the war of attrition was far from over, because Camilla realized she could no longer control the narrative through small jabs or dismissive commentary, and instead had shifted to a policy of cold avoidance, treating Catherine and her children with rigid formality whenever their paths crossed at official functions. For Catherine, this was actually a welcome development, because it meant her children were finally safe from toxic interference, allowing Charlotte to thrive in an environment where her confidence could grow unhindered. As the calendar turned toward the new year, the royal family braced themselves for the inevitable changes ahead, knowing full well that a mother's fierce protection had permanently rewritten the unspoken rules of the House of Windsor. The arrival of spring brought a tentative equilibrium to the royal household, but everyone knew that beneath the polished veneer of garden parties and state banquets, the underlying tension remained fully charged. Catherine continued her calculated approach, focusing 100% of her energy on her family duties and ensuring that her children felt secure, loved, and entirely protected from the petty dynamics of senior court politics. Charlotte had fully bounced back from her earlier hesitation, returning to her naturally confident and expressive self, chatting happily during family meals and throwing herself into her school activities with renewed enthusiasm. William watched the transformation with profound gratitude, knowing that his wife's unwavering firmness had saved their children from unnecessary emotional strain. Yet the true test of this fragile peace was destined to happen during the grand Trooping the Color celebrations. In June, an event where the entire royal family is forced to stand side by side on the iconic Buckingham Palace balcony under the intense glare of the global media and millions of watching eyes. For weeks beforehand, palace courtiers had been privately whispering about how the balcony lineup would be structured to minimize any potential friction between Camilla and Catherine. King Charles, sensitive to the delicate political landscape, personally reviewed the placement chart, ensuring a buffer zone of younger royals and working family members separated the Queen from the Wales family to keep everyone safely apart. When the big day finally arrived, London was buzzing with excitement, brilliant red coats, marching bands, roaring crowds, and the unmistakable thunder of the Royal Air Force fly past overhead inside the palace rooms. Before stepping out onto the balcony, the atmosphere was surprisingly subdued. Camilla, dressed in an elegant pale blue ensemble, kept mostly to herself, surrounded by her own circle of close aides, while Catherine busily checked George's uniform tie, adjusted Louis's collar, and knelt down to smooth out Charlotte's dress, giving her a reassuring smile and whispering that she looked like a little princess. Charlotte beamed back, completely relaxed and unfazed by the monumental occasion. As the grand doors swung open and the family stepped out onto the balcony, the roar of the crowd was deafening, washing over the stone facade like a tidal wave. Cameras flashed, instantly capturing every micro-expression across the royal lineup. Camilla stood toward the center near Charles, waving graciously to the adoring public, while maintaining a rigidly neutral expression. Whenever her eyes drifted in the direction of the Wales family, Catherine, positioned on the other side, stood proudly next to William, with George and Louis in front, and Charlotte right beside her, looking completely at ease, raising her small hand to wave enthusiastically at the cheering children down below. At one point during the fly past, when the jets roared overhead, trailing red, white, and blue smoke across the London sky, Charlotte instinctively leaned over to share an excited comment with her mother. Catherine smiled warmly, leaning down to listen, completely ignoring the rest of the balcony world and validating her daughter's presence with absolute grace. Camilla caught the brief exchange out of the corner of her eye, and for a fraction of a second her expression tightened into a hard, unreadable mask before she quickly forced a public smile back onto her face and turned away to speak with the Duke of Edinburgh. It was a tiny moment lasting barely 3 seconds, but for anyone watching closely, it told the entire story of how power had shifted within the royal family. Camilla realized in that exact moment that she could no longer exercise any subtle dominance or use her seniority to diminish the younger generation, because Catherine had permanently locked down the perimeter around her children, establishing a fortress of maternal protection that nothing could penetrate. The balcony appearance concluded smoothly with the traditional national anthem and joyful cheers echoing through the mall as the family retreated back inside the doors to the grand reception hall. Inside the cool interior of the palace, the tension finally dissipated as relaxed chatter began to fill the room. Charles walked over to William and Catherine, offering a warm, appreciative nod of acknowledgement, clearly relieved that the high-profile event had passed without any public drama or embarrassing missteps. He looked at Charlotte, who was excitedly describing the red arrow smoke trails to her younger brother, and gently patted her head, saying she had been an absolute star throughout the entire ceremony. Camilla, lingering near the far entrance of the hall, watched the interaction with a quiet, distant expression before turning to her staff and quietly making her departure, signaling an unspoken surrender of the informal territory she had tried to claim over the royal grandchildren. In the days and weeks that followed, the ripple effect of that balcony appearance were felt across every level of the palace hierarchy. Courtiers realized that the rules of engagement had changed permanently, and that any future attempt to sideline or undermine the Wales children would be met with an impenetrable wall of maternal resistance. For Catherine, the victory was quiet, but absolute. She hadn't needed to shout or launch a public PR war to defend her daughter. She had simply used steady, unshakable resolve to draw a line that no one in the royal family dared to cross again. Life at Adelaide Cottage returned to its peaceful, joyful rhythm. School projects, weekend bike rides in Windsor Great Park, and bedtime stories read without a single cloud of anxiety hanging overhead. Charlotte grew taller, bolder, and more confident each passing month, knowing deep down inside her heart that no matter how big the palace walls were or how intimidating the crown might seem, she had a mother who would always stand like a shield between her and the world, ensuring she could grow up feeling safe, valued, and entirely free to be herself.